When Black CEO J.D. Walker stops in a small town, he faces blatant racism and abuse of power from Sheriff Pike, who sees his success as a threat. What begins as a simple encounter spirals into humiliation, hostility, and systemic injustice, as Pike uses his authority to demean and undermine J.D. The tension escalates as J.D. remains calm, navigating the sheriff's relentless attempts to strip him of his dignity. This gripping story exposes the infuriating reality of racism in America and challenges viewers to confront the deep-seated prejudice that still thrives in positions of power. David adjusted the brim of his faded red baseball cap, shielding his eyes from the scorching afternoon sun as he stepped onto the sidewalk. For him, the hat was just another accessory, worn and comfortable, with memories stitched into every frayed edge. But to strangers, it was a signal, a judgment. The streets of his old neighborhood had changed since he'd left years ago. Gleaming cafes replaced corner stores, yoga studios stood where laundromats used to buzz with life. David felt like a stranger in his own town, a man trying to blend in where he no longer fit. Today was supposed to be simple, a visit to his childhood home, a place now occupied by someone else. He promised his daughter he'd show her the house where he grew up, tell her about the trees he climbed and the friends he made. Yet even as they walked, something felt off. Side glances, tight smiles, strangers who moved just a bit quicker as David and his little girl strolled past. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed it, but this time, it was about to change everything. What started as a quiet walk home would lead to a confrontation, a viral video, and a ripple effect no one could have predicted. Title: A Seat at the Table. Jeremiah J.D. Walker stepped out of his sleek black sedan, the hum of the engine softening as it powered down. Despite his choice of an understated car, a mid-range luxury sedan without the over-the-top bells and whistles, it still turned heads. The quiet street in the small town of Hazelwood had grown unnaturally still, as if his arrival had knocked it off balance. He adjusted his navy blazer, tugged at the crisp white cuffs of his shirt, and paused to glance around. His movements were measured, thoughtful. J.D. was always aware of how he occupied a room, or a sidewalk. In this case, his tailored clothing, sharp but unassuming, didn't shout wealth, yet anyone looking closely would notice the details. A fine watch on his wrist, polished shoes with just the right shine. It was confidence without ostentation. The morning air was thick with the smell of fresh-baked bread from Hazel's bakery down the street, mingling with the gasoline odor that clung to the old gas station nearby. It was a place caught between eras, a sleepy town with cracked sidewalks and painted-over signs, hiding ambitions for gentrification behind lingering resistance to change. J.D. tilted his head slightly, observing the small courthouse across the square brick and mortar from another time, proudly sporting a flagpole that looked like it hadn't been repaired since before he was born. The courthouse steps were wide, well-worn and empty, save for a single pigeon pecking near the base. No fanfare, no grand entrance. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Just a week earlier, J.D. had delivered the keynote at a bustling tech conference in San Francisco, his face projected on towering screens for thousands to see. Cameras flashed as he shook hands with investors, journalists, and industry titans. Yet here he stood, a man with a name known across boardrooms and billion-dollar circles, and the town square treated him like he was invisible. He didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it this way. "Ready, boss?" His driver, Reggie, called softly, leaning against the open door. Reggie was a trusted friend, not just a driver, but he always held back his commentary in unfamiliar territory. He knew better. J.D. offered a small nod. "I'll handle it from here. Go grab a coffee or something, I'll call you when I'm done." Reggie hesitated for half a second, his brow furrowing. "You sure you know how these places can be?" J.D. turned to face him, flashing that calm, reassuring smile that had soothed far more anxious minds than Reggie's. "I'm sure, don't worry." With a quiet sigh, Reggie relented, slipping back into the car. The door closed with a soft thunk, and just like that, J.D. was alone. He strode across the square, his movements easy, unhurried. Every step echoed faintly against the silence of the town. Hazelwood had no idea who he was, and for now, that suited him just fine. Today wasn't about flashy entrances or boardroom victories, it was about unfinished business. Inside Hazelwood's Silver Spoon Diner, the The mood was as predictable as the stale coffee smell wafting through the swinging kitchen doors. A heavy silence met him when he entered, one that always greeted unfamiliar faces, especially unfamiliar black faces. The doorbell above the entrance gave a shrill ding, but no one turned to look, no one greeted him. A few regulars sat in the corner booth, old-timers with weathered faces, suspenders hanging over creased shirts. Their conversation stopped mid-sentence, replaced by wary glances exchanged over lukewarm cups of coffee. A single man at the counter sipped slowly, pretending to read the paper in front of him. JD had seen this act before. It didn't bother him. Don't react, hold steady. He'd trained himself for these moments since his earliest days. The waitress, a woman in her mid-50s, her graying hair pulled into a bun, finally broke the silence. Her eyes flicked toward him, surprise quickly shifting into something guarded. "Take a seat anywhere," she said flatly, snapping her gum. JD smiled politely, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough. He scanned the diner, plastic booths with faded cushions, chipped tables, laminated menus curled at the edges, before settling on a small table in the corner. It was tucked near the window, away from curious glances. He liked corners. Corners offered perspective. He eased into the booth, his posture straight but relaxed, and picked up the flimsy menu. He didn't need to look at it. Diners like this all had the same offerings: bacon, pancakes, hash browns drowned in butter, but he appreciated the ritual of pretending. It gave people time to adjust. The waitress approached, pad in hand, her pen already tapping against the paper. She looked him over quickly, trying to decide what box he fit into. Her tone was cordial, but cool. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes, please, black," JD replied smoothly, "and I'll take the 2-egg special over easy." She scribbled the order without comment, then turned on her heel, her worn sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. No conversation, no pleasantries, just the bare minimum. JD exhaled slowly, turning his attention to the window. Outside, Hazelwood moved at its own pace, a few cars rolling lazily down the street, a teenager balancing on a skateboard near the gas station. On the other side of the square, an older black man in a threadbare jacket swept the courthouse steps with slow, practiced motions. A seat at the table, JD thought to himself, but never quite part of the room. The diner remained quiet, save for the clink of utensils against plates and the hum of a far-off radio playing classic rock. JD didn't need to look around to know eyes were on him. It was always the same. A stranger walks into town, and the room collectively decides they're either a threat or an oddity to be ignored. It wasn't hate, it was habit. He folded his hands together, resting them on the table, as he waited. A familiar calm settled over him. Stillness had become his strength, his ability to command attention through presence alone, without uttering a single word. The door dinged again, and this time, someone did look up. An older man in a tan sheriff's uniform stepped inside, his hand adjusting the leather belt slung over his rounded belly. Sheriff Andrew Pike, Hazelwood's lawman, for over 20 years. He scanned the room, then paused when his eyes landed on JD, met his gaze briefly before turning back to the window. He wasn't here to make enemies. Not yet. Sheriff Pike approached the counter, leaning against it as he nodded toward the waitress. "Morning, Sally," he grunted. "Coffee to go?" The waitress, Sally, nodded, quickly pouring a fresh cup from the pot behind the counter. "Coming right up, Sheriff." The sheriff didn't say anything at first, but JD could feel him watching. Studying. After a moment, Sheriff Pike spoke, his voice low but deliberate. "Don't think I've seen you around here before." JD didn't flinch. He turned back to face the sheriff, his expression calm and polite. "Just passing through," he replied evenly. "Uh-huh," Pike muttered, his gaze narrowing slightly. "Passing through where?" "The diner," JD said with the faintest hint of a smile. He gestured toward his half-empty coffee cup. "Best coffee in Hazelwood, I hear." The corner of Pike's mouth twitched, but it wasn't quite a smile. He lifted his cup, tipped his hat toward Sally, and turned to leave. "You enjoy your meal," he said over his shoulder, the words laced with something unspoken. JD didn't respond. He let the sheriff's words hang there, absorbing the weight of them like a stone dropped into still water. Moments like this were the ones that mattered, not because they were loud, but because they were quiet, tense. The kind of moments that hinted at bigger problems simmering just beneath the surface. Sally returned a moment later, sliding the plate of eggs and toast across the table. "Here you go," she said briskly, her tone just as guarded as before. "Thank you," J.D. said simply, offering her another small smile. She hesitated for a moment, her pen tapping against her pad again. "You need anything else?" she asked finally. J.D. shook his head. "I'm all set." Sally nodded quickly and turned away, disappearing behind the counter once more. J.D. picked up his fork and knife, cutting into the eggs with careful precision. Outside, the sun had risen higher, spilling light across the square. The courthouse steps gleamed faintly, swept clean of dust. The black man with the broom was gone, but his absence was felt, like a gap in the rhythm of the morning. J.D. chewed slowly, his mind turning over Sheriff Pike's words, the glances from the other diners, and Sally's reluctant civility. "Don't react. Hold steady," he reminded himself again. He wasn't here for trouble, but trouble, as always, had a way of finding him. J.D. cut into his toast with deliberate calm, chewing slowly as the sounds of Hazelwood's Silver Spoon Diner buzzed quietly around him. The smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease lingered in the air, a reminder of how time seemed to stand still in towns like this. He wasn't new to this dance, walking into a room where he didn't look like he belonged, then watching as suspicion blossomed like weeds around him. The diner wasn't hostile, but the weight of 1,000 silent judgments pressed down on him with every forkful of food. "Don't react, hold steady," J.D. reminded himself, forcing his mind to settle. His phone vibrated softly against the table. He glanced at the screen. A text from Reggie. "You good, boss? Need me back?" J.D. smirked faintly and typed back, "All good. Finishing up." He slipped the phone back into his pocket, just as the diner door dinged again. This time, the sound was sharper, almost biting. The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. 2 men entered, their boots thudding heavily against the linoleum floor. J.D. didn't need to look up to know who they were. The sheriff had gone outside, likely made a call, and now the cavalry had arrived. 2 deputies by the sound of it, all stern footfalls and clipped voices. "Excuse me." The voice was gruff and controlled, designed to command attention. J.D. looked up slowly, meeting the narrowed gaze of the taller deputy. The man had a buzz cut and wore mirrored sunglasses, despite standing indoors. His partner, shorter and stockier, hovered a step behind him, eyes sharp and cautious. J.D. put his fork down and folded his hands on the table, his movements calm and precise. "Morning, officers," he greeted smoothly. The taller deputy's lip twitched, unimpressed by J.D.'s politeness. "Mind if we have a word with you outside?" J.D. blinked, glancing briefly around the diner. The regulars were staring openly now, no more subtle glances or pretended disinterest. Sally, the waitress, stood behind the counter, her face pale as she wiped down an already clean coffee mug. "Is there a problem?" J.D. asked, his voice level. "We just need to ask a few questions," the deputy replied. His tone was neutral, but the unspoken assumption hung thick in the air. "You don't belong here." J.D. took a slow breath, steadying himself. "I'm perfectly comfortable here, officers. What questions could you possibly have for me?" The deputy's jaw tensed, as if he wasn't used to being questioned. He glanced briefly at his partner before stepping closer to J.D. "His table. We had a call," he said slowly, emphasizing each word. "About a suspicious individual hanging around town. You fit the description." J.D.'s stomach tightened. A suspicious individual. The phrase echoed like a bad memory, his grip on his composure held firm, though the familiar mix of frustration and disbelief churned beneath the surface. "And what exactly is this description?" J.D. asked evenly. The deputy's eyes narrowed behind the mirrored lenses. "Black man, late 30s, well-dressed, sound familiar?" A tense silence settled over the diner. The regulars, the truckers, even Sally. All of them seemed to shrink into the background, as if distancing themselves from the unfolding scene. J.D. held the deputy's gaze for a beat, feeling the weight of the accusation hanging between them. "Suspicious because I'm black. Suspicious because I'm here." The shorter deputy finally spoke up, his voice softer, but no less firm. "We're just doing our job, sir. If you could step outside for a minute, we'll clear this up real quick." JD exhaled slowly, his shoulders loosening, though his voice remained steady. "Gentlemen, I'm sitting in a diner eating breakfast, I haven't caused a disturbance, and I haven't broken any laws. If someone thinks I'm suspicious for doing that, then maybe you need to question the caller, not me." The taller deputy bristled visibly at JD, as refusal to comply. His partner shifted uncomfortably, as if sensing that this could spiral into something worse. The tension in the room thickened, pulling everyone into its orbit. "Look, Mr. Walker," JD interjected, his voice cutting through the deputy's. "Jeremiah Walker?" The deputy's expression faltered briefly, as if the name carried a weight he hadn't expected. "Jeremiah Walker?" he repeated, testing the name. JD leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unnerving in its restraint. "Yes, CEO of Walker Solutions. You might have heard of it, tech company. I was just in San Francisco last week, on a panel with industry leaders. Maybe you caught it on the news." The deputy said nothing, but the flicker of uncertainty in his stance betrayed him. His partner's brow furrowed, recognition dawning slowly, though he didn't say a word. JD pressed on, his tone sharpening just slightly. "I'm here on business, my business. And if I'd walked in here looking a little different, I doubt we'd be having this conversation. Am I wrong?" The room was silent. No one dared move. The shorter deputy cleared his throat, trying to diffuse the tension. "We're just trying to make sure everything's in order, sir. You know how small towns are. People get nervous when they see unfamiliar faces." "People like you," JD heard in the unspoken words. He tightened his jaw but forced a polite smile. "I see. Well, I appreciate your concern, officers. But as you can see, everything is in order. I'd like to finish my breakfast now." For a long moment, the deputies didn't move. The taller one looked ready to press further, his posture rigid and confrontational, but his partner laid a hand on his arm, a silent suggestion to let it go. "Fine," the taller deputy said finally, his voice clipped and curt. "But don't go wandering around where you don't belong." JD held his gaze without flinching. "I'll keep that in mind." The two deputies turned and walked out, their boots pounding like drums against the diner floor. The door swung shut behind them with a final, decisive clang. JD let out a quiet breath, his chest still tight with simmering frustration. Around him, the diner slowly came back to life. Though the energy had shifted, the old-timers went back to their coffee, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. Sally busied herself behind the counter, refusing to look his way. JD glanced at his plate, his appetite now gone. He picked up his phone and shot a quick text to Reggie, "Swing back around. We're done here." Outside, the sunlight felt sharper than before, a little too bright for comfort. Reggie was waiting by the curb when JD stepped out, his expression tense and watchful. He'd clearly seen the deputies leave. "You good?" Reggie asked carefully. JD nodded, slipping into the passenger seat and shutting the door behind him. "Let's go." Reggie pulled away from the curb, the engine rumbling softly as they rolled down the quiet streets of Hazelwood. JD stared out the window, his expression unreadable, though his mind was far from calm. Reggie broke the silence after a while. "It's always the same story, huh?" JD didn't respond at first. He watched the courthouse fade in the rearview mirror, the brick facade glowing gold in the morning light. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Same story, different town." He leaned back in his seat, the tension still coiling through his chest. The scene at the diner replayed in his mind, the wary stares, the subtle slights, the deputies who saw a black man in a nice suit and assumed he didn't belong. He'd built companies, created jobs, earned respect in rooms full of powerful people, but in a small-town diner with stale coffee and cracked linoleum, none of that mattered. All they saw was what they chose to see. Reggie glanced at him, concern flickering across his face. "What now, boss?" JD turned his gaze back to the road ahead, his jaw tight with quiet determination. "Now," he said evenly, "we get to work." Reggie didn't ask what that meant. He didn't have to. The tension in JD's shoulders hadn't eased, even as Reggie guided the car out of Hazelwood's town center. The diner had been one insult, one judgment, layered over countless others he'd endured in his life. But what bothered him most wasn't the words, the stares, or even the deputy's assumptions. It was the quiet acceptance of it all, the silence that spoke louder than any insult ever could. "Where to next, boss?" Reggie asked cautiously, his eyes flicking between JD and the road. The unspoken weight of the morning still hung between them. JD glanced at his watch. "Head to the courthouse." Reggie raised a brow but didn't argue. "You sure? After what just happened, maybe we—" "Just drive," JD interrupted softly. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. Reggie sighed and nodded, turning down Main Street. As they neared the courthouse, JD spotted the sheriff's cruiser parked out front. An unnecessary reminder that this town had already decided who he was before he'd said a word. Inside the Hazelwood courthouse, the air felt thick and heavy, the kind of quiet tension found in buildings where time had long forgotten to move forward. The main courtroom wasn't much: a polished wooden bench, scuffed pews, and a flag in the corner with frayed edges. A few people milled about in hushed tones, none of them acknowledging JD as he entered. He moved toward the back, taking a seat quietly, his presence immediately drawing sidelong glances. A small-town court case, a property dispute, was wrapping up at the judge's bench. The judge, an older white man with thin, silver hair and a perpetually irritated expression, presided with a lazy authority. His nameplate read, "Judge Lawrence Mitchell." JD had seen men like Mitchell before, men who believed power was their birthright. Reggie followed in, lingering by the door, visibly uneasy. "This place doesn't sit right," he muttered under his breath. JD gave a faint nod. It didn't sit right with him either. The courtroom doors swung open again with a jarring creak, and Sheriff Pike entered, his boots thudding loudly against the floorboards. Behind him trailed the same two deputies from earlier. Pike's gaze locked onto JD immediately, his lips curling into something between a sneer and a smirk. JD didn't flinch. The bailiff called out, "All rise," as Judge Mitchell shuffled some papers and looked over the room. His tired eyes landed briefly on JD, before returning to the bench. "We'll take a short recess," Judge Mitchell announced, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. As the sparse crowd began to disperse, the sheriff and his deputies made their move. Sheriff Pike stepped directly in front of JD, his presence looming like a shadow. "Didn't expect to see you here," Pike said, his tone casual, though the threat was undeniable. JD met the sheriff's gaze evenly. "I'm here on business," he replied coolly. "Something wrong with that, Sheriff?" "Depends on the business," Pike said, folding his arms. "You stirring things up again, Mr. Walker?" "You've been getting some attention this morning." JD's jaw tightened. "I'm not the one stirring anything up." "Funny," Pike replied, his voice dropping. "From where I stand, you're the only one out of place." Before JD could respond, the two deputies flanked him on either side. "You're coming with us," the taller one said, his hand hovering too close to his holster. Reggie took a step forward from the door. "Hey, what is this?" The sheriff turned sharply. "Step back, son. This doesn't concern you." Reggie's eyes darted to JD, who raised a hand, silently urging him to stand down. "It's fine, Reggie," he said firmly. "I've got this." Reggie hesitated, his fists clenching, but he stepped back as instructed. JD stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, his expression calm. He knew better than to give these men any excuse to escalate. "Care to tell me why I'm being asked to leave, Sheriff?" "You're not being asked," Pike shot back, his voice sharp. "We're going to have a conversation outside. You seem to think you can just walk into our town like you own the place. Time someone sets you straight." A ripple of anger coursed through JD, hot and quick, but he held it back. He refused to let them see it. "Then let's talk," he said simply. The deputies grabbed his arms, not roughly but firm enough to make a point, as they led him through the empty courtroom. He let them. His mind was already moving 10 steps ahead. The small, gray-walled interrogation room at the back of the sheriff's office smelled like stale coffee and sweat. JD sat with his hands flat on the metal table, his posture straight and composed. Across from him sat Sheriff Pike, his mirrored sunglasses now resting on his hat, revealing sharp, calculating eyes. "So, Mr. Big City CEO," Pike began, leaning back in his chair. "What's your real reason for being here?" JD met his gaze without blinking. "I already told you business." "What kind of business?" Pike pressed, his tone mocking. "Looking to buy up half the town. Put up a shiny office building?" JD shook his head slowly, a thin smile curling his lips. "You'd be surprised how little I want from this town, Sheriff." Pike's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me, boy." The word hit the air like a gunshot. JD felt the anger rise again, sharp and immediate, but he forced himself to stay calm. He tilted his head slightly, his voice measured. "Sheriff Pike, I suggest you choose your words carefully." The deputy from the diner, the shorter one, shifted uncomfortably by the door. His gaze flickered toward JD and back again, as if he was rethinking everything he knew about the situation. The other deputy, however, stood still as stone, his arms crossed over his chest. Pike leaned forward, his face a mask of disdain. "Let me explain something to you, Walker. People like you don't walk into Hazelwood and start making demands. You think your money, your suit, your fancy titles mean something here. They don't. Not to me." JD's calm didn't waver, though every muscle in his body screamed to fight back. He had worked too hard, climbed too far, to let this man diminish him. "Not today. I'm not making demands," JD replied quietly. "But if you think intimidation is going to work, you're wasting your time. I'm not going anywhere." Pike's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that." The room fell silent. For a long moment, neither man moved, the tension between them crackling like static. Finally, Pike stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a loud screech. "Hold him here," he ordered the deputies. "I'll be back." As the sheriff disappeared through the door, the shorter deputy hesitated, his eyes lingering on JD, for just a beat too long. There was something there. Hesitation, doubt, maybe even sympathy. But he said nothing. JD leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as the door slammed shut. The anger bubbling beneath his surface hadn't lessened, but he forced himself to focus. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had faced worse in his life. Fights that mattered, battles that tested everything he was. Hazelwood and Sheriff Pike didn't know it yet, but they had picked the wrong man to underestimate. JD glanced at the door, his resolve hardening. He wasn't leaving this town quietly. Outside, Sheriff Pike paced the office, his jaw set as he muttered to himself. "Who does he think he is?" he hissed under his breath. Behind him, the short deputy finally spoke up. "Sheriff, are we sure about this? He hasn't done anything wrong." Pike spun, his eyes blazing. "Don't tell me you're falling for his act, Mitchell." The deputy, Mitchell, shifted uneasily. "It's not an act. You know who he is, don't you, Jeremiah Walker? He's on TV and Forbes. This isn't just some guy passing through." Pike froze, his expression darkening. Recognition flickered behind his eyes, but he smothered it quickly. "I don't care who he is. He doesn't belong here." Mitchell swallowed hard, clearly torn, but said nothing more. Back in the room, JD stared at the clock on the wall. Time dragged, each minute stretching endlessly. But he wasn't worried. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't Sheriff Pike who walked in. It was Mitchell. The younger deputy cleared his throat, clearly nervous. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, glancing at the door as if making sure Pike wasn't nearby. "You should call your lawyer." JD raised an eyebrow, his calm composure breaking slightly. "Why?" Mitchell hesitated. "Because this isn't going to end the way you think it is." JD's jaw tightened. Whatever was happening outside that door, it was bigger than a petty sheriff with a chip on his shoulder. Something was coming, something that could change everything, and JD was ready for it. JD remained seated in the dim interrogation room, the faint hum of the fluorescent light overhead, the only sound as Mitchell shifted nervously near the door. His unease was palpable, as if torn between doing his job and recognizing the growing absurdity of the situation. "What do you mean this isn't going to end the way I think?" JD asked, his tone even but edged with steel. Mitchell glanced at the door, lowering his voice. "Sheriff Pike's got something to prove," he muttered, avoiding JD's sharp gaze. "He doesn't care who you are or what you're here for. You're an outsider, a black man in a suit. That's enough." JD leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And you're okay with this?" Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting at his belt. "It's not about what I'm okay with," he replied, his voice cracking under the weight of his own hesitation. "It's about how things work here." J.D. let the words hang in the air, his jaw tightening. "How things work here," he repeated. "You know exactly what's happening, Deputy, and you're telling me you're going to let this slide?" Mitchell swallowed hard. "I don't know what you expect me to do, Mr. Walker. I'm just a deputy." J.D. stared at him for a long moment, his calm demeanor masking the fire building in his chest. He could see the conflict playing out in Mitchell's eyes, his unwillingness to challenge the system that had shaped him. But J.D. had seen men like Mitchell before, good men trapped in bad circumstances. It wasn't fear that stopped them, it was resignation. "Deputy," J.D. said quietly, his voice low but commanding. "There will come a day when you'll have to decide whether you want to be part of the problem or part of the solution. Don't let this be the day you choose wrong." Mitchell froze, the words hitting him like a gut punch. He opened his mouth as if to reply, but before he could, the door swung open with a loud bang. Sheriff Pike entered, his face flushed and his expression thunderous. "Mitchell, out!" Pike snapped, jerking his head toward the door. Mitchell hesitated, his gaze flickering toward J.D. Then back to Pike. "Sheriff, I said out!" Pike barked, his voice booming off the cinderblock walls. Mitchell sighed heavily and stepped out of the room, glancing back at J.D. one last time before the door closed behind him. The tension in the room sharpened as Pike loomed over the table, his mouth set in a grim line. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Pike growled, pacing around J.D. like a predator sizing up its prey. "Waltzing into my town with your fancy suit? Your big city attitude? Acting like you own the place?" "I never said I owned anything," J.D. replied, his voice unwavering. "But I don't need your permission to be here, Sheriff." Pike slammed his hands on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "Watch your tone," he hissed. "You don't run things here, boy, I do." J.D. didn't flinch. Instead, he looked directly into Pike's eyes, his calm defiance cutting through the sheriff's bluster like a razor. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" Pike blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "What did you just say?" "You think power comes from a badge," J.D. continued, his voice controlled. "But all it does is give you an excuse to act on your worst impulses. You're not upholding the law, Sheriff. You're abusing it." Pike's face turned red, veins popping along his neck. "You watch yourself, Walker. You're this close to making me real angry." J.D. tilted his head, unbothered by the threat. "Funny, I thought we were already there." The sheriff's patience snapped. "Stand up," Pike barked, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for obstructing justice." J.D. remained seated, his gaze locked on Pike's. "On what grounds?" "I don't need grounds," Pike spat, lunging toward him. Before Pike's hand could close around J.D.'s arm, the door burst open again, this time revealing Reggie, flanked by a woman in a sharp navy suit and a no-nonsense expression. She moved like someone who owned the room the moment she entered it, her heels clicking like a metronome against the floor. "That won't be necessary, Sheriff," the woman said crisply, holding up a stack of papers. "I'm Veronica Hayes, Mr. Walker's attorney, and if you don't unhand my client, you're going to have a much bigger problem than whatever grudge you're nursing." Pike froze, his face contorting in a mix of anger and disbelief. "What the hell is this?" "Legal intervention," Veronica shot back, stepping between J.D. and Pike. "I've been fully briefed on this situation, and unless you'd like to be dragged into federal court for wrongful detainment, I suggest you let my client go immediately." Pike's hands trembled with frustration. "You can't just—" "I can, and I will," Veronica interrupted. "You've overstepped, Sheriff. Any further action against Mr. Walker without just cause will be seen as harassment." She gave him a pointed look, her voice sharp as glass. "I assume you understand what that means?" Pike seethed, but said nothing. J.D. slowly rose to his feet, brushing invisible dust off his suit sleeve. "You know, Sheriff," he said, his tone steady and deliberate. "You should learn to pick your battles, because this one you're going to lose." Pike glared at him, fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move as J.D. followed Veronica toward the door. Reggie shot the sheriff a smirk as he turned to leave, adding, "Y'all have a blessed day." Outside the sheriff's office, the afternoon sun blazed overhead, its heat doing little to ease the simmering tension. Veronica turned to JD, her expression tight with concern. "They're rattled," she said. "But this isn't over." JD nodded, his gaze fixed on the quiet main street stretching in front of him. "It won't be until we make it over." Reggie glanced between them. "What now, boss?" JD exhaled slowly, the weight of the morning settling on his shoulders. "We get ready. Pike's not going to let this go quietly, and I have no intention of backing down." Veronica raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about this? Men like Pike don't care about consequences, they double down." JD looked at her, resolve etched into every line of his face. "Then we'll make him face them anyway." As they walked toward the car, Reggie's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and whistled low. "You're going to want to see this." He handed the phone to JD, who frowned as he scanned the video playing on the screen. It was a recording, grainy, but clear enough. The footage showed Sheriff Pike and his deputies in the diner earlier that morning, their voices carrying as they confronted JD. A young man's voice could be heard narrating the video. "Small town sheriff harassing a black man for eating breakfast. Hazelwood's got some explaining to do." JD felt a chill ripple through him, not out of fear, but out of understanding. "Who posted this?" Reggie smirked. "Some kid sitting near the back. He caught the whole thing. It's already picking up steam online. People are asking questions." JD handed the phone back, his mind working. The video changed everything. It was no longer just his word against theirs. It was proof, tangible, undeniable proof. Veronica's expression hardened. "This is good, but it's also dangerous. Pike's going to be backed into a corner, and men like him don't take well to being exposed." "Let him come," JD replied quietly, his voice steady. "He's been comfortable too long. It's time someone made him uncomfortable." He turned toward the courthouse looming in the distance, its shadow stretching across the road. The stakes were rising, but so was his determination. Hazelwood might not have known who he was when he walked into town, but they were about to find out. The sun was beginning to dip behind Hazelwood's courthouse, bathing the town in a hazy gold glow that did nothing to soften the storm brewing inside its walls. JD Walker stood at the center of the courtroom, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. Across from him, Sheriff Pike sat with his attorney, his face red with anger, his jaw set, as if he were chewing nails. The room was packed, locals, journalists, and even a few supporters from out of town. It wasn't just a hearing anymore, it had become an event, the town's festering wound of prejudice and corruption finally exposed to the world. JD's attorney, Veronica Hayes, stood at his side, her legal pad in hand. "You ready for this?" she murmured under her breath. JD gave a small nod, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. "I've been ready." The bailiff's voice boomed. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Owens." The room stood, and an older judge entered, his presence serious and deliberate. He settled into his seat, removing his glasses, and looking around the courtroom. "We are here today to address the charges brought forth against Mr. J.D. Walker," he said, his tone weary but firm, "and the counterclaims of harassment, false detainment, and misconduct against Sheriff Pike and the Hazelwood Sheriff's Department. Let's keep this professional. I won't tolerate theatrics." J.D. shifted his stance, his hands in his pockets, calm, steady. He'd faced tougher adversaries overseas, in hostile lands where bullets flew and trust was scarce. This, he reminded himself, was just another battlefield. "Ms. Hayes," the judge prompted, gesturing for her to begin. Veronica strode forward, her voice clear and sharp. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Walker, is a successful businessman and community leader. He came to Hazelwood to handle a private matter, and instead, he was harassed, detained without just cause, and intimidated by Sheriff Pike. My client's only offense..." She turned toward the jury, pausing. "He didn't look like he belonged." A murmur rippled through the room. Pike's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is conjecture." Judge Owens raised a hand. "Sustained, Ms. Hayes. Stick to the facts." "Of course, Your Honor," Veronica said smoothly. "The facts are that Sheriff Pike and his deputies unlawfully detained my client in the absence of any evidence or suspicion of wrongdoing. Not only did Sheriff Pike attempt to intimidate Mr. Walker in public, but we now have evidence suggesting a pattern of systemic racial targeting under his watch." The courtroom erupted into whispers. Sheriff Pike, finally broke his silence, his voice booming. "This is ridiculous," he barked, standing suddenly. "This man's been running around town stirring up trouble, acting like he owns the place." "Sit down, Sheriff Pike," the judge ordered, his tone sharp. Pike glared across the room at J.D., his anger barely contained. "You think you can come into my town," he growled, his voice carrying through the courtroom, "and tear it apart because you've got some fancy suit and a lawyer? You're nothing." The words landed like a slap, their venom rippling through the air. J.D. didn't move, his face expressionless as he stepped forward, his deep voice resonating across the room. "You're right about one thing, Sheriff," J.D. said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't your town. Hazelwood belongs to the people who live here, the ones you've terrorized, ignored, and looked down on for years." Pike sneered, his lips curling. "Big words for a man who doesn't belong here." "And there it is," J.D. said calmly, looking to the judge, to the jury, and then the crowd. "That's the truth of it, isn't it? It was never about my actions, it was about how I looked." The room fell silent. "I earned my way into every room I've ever walked into," J.D. continued, his voice controlled but simmering with power. "I worked for every success, every achievement, and no man, not even one with a badge, gets to decide whether or not I belong." Veronica stepped in, holding up her phone. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a video recorded by a witness during Mr. Walker's unlawful detainment." The judge frowned. "Proceed." Veronica hit play on the video. The grainy footage filled the courtroom speakers. Sheriff Pike and his deputies standing in the diner, their voices unmistakable. "People like you don't just show up here," Pike's voice echoed in the recording, cold and smug. "You're in the wrong place, friend." The murmurs grew louder as the video continued, capturing J.D.'s calm responses and the sheriff's escalation. The words were damning indefensible. Pike's attorney leaned over, whispering harshly to him, but the sheriff waved him off. "This is nonsense," Pike snapped, standing again. "You think this changes anything? These people don't care about your fancy videos." "Enough," the judge roared, slamming his gavel. The room fell silent again, and Judge Owens turned to Pike, his expression icy. "Sheriff, you'll conduct yourself appropriately in this courtroom." Pike's face was a mixture of rage and embarrassment, but he finally sat down, his fists clenched tightly against the table. Veronica approached J.D., whispering softly, "You pushed him to show his true colors. Now we seal the deal." J.D. nodded slightly and stepped back. Outside the courthouse, the air was electric. The news trucks had gathered, and a crowd was forming. Locals who'd watched the sheriff run Hazelwood with impunity for years, and visitors drawn by the unfolding story. Reggie stood near the steps, watching as J.D. emerged with Veronica by his side. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised like weapons. "Mr. Walker, how does it feel to expose Sheriff Pike's actions? Do you think Hazelwood will finally change?" J.D. raised his hand, silencing the frenzy. He looked out at the crowd, his voice clear. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "It's about accountability. People like Sheriff Pike have held power for too long, unchecked and unchallenged. I'm not here to tear this town apart. I'm here to show that Hazelwood can be better." Applause broke out among the crowd, mixed with nods of agreement and hopeful murmurs. Sheriff Pike burst out of the courthouse behind him, his face red, his voice booming. "This isn't over," he shouted, pointing at J.D. "You think you can come into my town and take me down? I'll bury you before that happens." Pike's threats echoed across the steps, but J.D. didn't flinch. He turned, facing Pike one last time, his expression unshakable. "You've already buried yourself, Sheriff," J.D. replied coolly. "The truth did the digging. All I had to do was shine a light." As Pike's deputies scrambled to calm him, Veronica leaned toward J.D. and whispered, "He's unraveling. It's over." J.D. nodded, though his face remained serious. "It's not over until this town starts to heal." He turned back to the crowd, lifting his voice once more. "This isn't the end of the fight. It's just the beginning. Hazelwood deserves better, and it starts today." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy shaking the very foundations of the courthouse. Pike was led away, his shouting growing faint in the distance, while J.D. stood tall on the steps, a beacon of resolve and strength. He knew this moment was bigger than him. It wasn't just a victory against Pike, it was a crack in the system that had upheld men like him for far too long. But J.D. also knew one thing. Cracks let in the light. The Hazelwood courthouse had never seen a day like this. The air inside was heavy with anticipation, as the room filled with murmurs from both sides of the aisle. Locals who'd long accepted the unspoken rules of Sheriff Pike's reign, and others who'd come to see justice, maybe for the first time, take its rightful place. J.D. Walker sat at the defense table, back straight and head high. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with focus. Across the room, Sheriff Pike sat slouched in his chair, like a man daring the world to challenge him. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Pike waved him off, his lip curling in irritation. This wasn't a trial yet, just a preliminary hearing to determine the validity of charges, but everyone knew what was really on the line. J.D. wasn't just fighting for his own vindication, he was standing against years of unspoken injustice, arrogance, and fear that had bled through the town like a slow poison. The judge entered, banging his gavel. This court is now in session. As the proceedings began, Veronica Hayes took the floor. She exuded confidence as she spoke, each word crisp and measured. Your Honor, this hearing is about far more than my client, J.D. Walker. It's about accountability, corruption, and the abuse of power. We intend to prove that Sheriff Pike and his department have systematically targeted individuals like Mr. Walker, not because of their actions, but because of who they are. The words hung in the air. Sheriff Pike's lawyer, a bulldog of a man named Carter Finch, stood immediately, puffing out his chest. Objection, Your Honor, irrelevant and inflammatory. The judge raised an eyebrow. Ms. Hayes, stay focused on the case at hand. Veronica didn't flinch. Of course, Your Honor. The case at hand is this. My client was unlawfully detained, humiliated, and harassed, with no probable cause. Sheriff Pike's justification, Mr. Walker didn't belong. She turned, walking toward the jury box. But belonging isn't dictated by skin color, wealth, or preconceived notions. It's dictated by rights we are all entitled to. Carter stood again, his voice booming. Your Honor, there's no evidence to support these claims. This is all conjecture. Veronica turned slowly, her gaze cool and measured. No evidence, Mr. Finch. I'm glad you brought that up. She gestured to the bailiff. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit Exhibit A. The bailiff handed the judge a flash drive. The courtroom leaned forward in collective curiosity as the screen flickered to life. It was the diner video, the grainy recording taken by the college student. The courtroom watched in silence as Pike's voice echoed through the speakers. People like you don't just show up here. This is my town. You're in the wrong place, friend. The room erupted in whispers. Pike's face darkened, his hand curling into a fist. Your Honor, Veronica said calmly as the video ended. These are the words of a man who believes he is above the law. Sheriff Pike didn't stop my client because he suspected a crime. He stopped him because he could. Pike's lawyer leapt to his feet again, his voice cracking. This video is taken out of context. Context? Veronica's voice was sharp. What context justifies harassment? What context makes it acceptable for a man sworn to serve and protect to abuse his power based on race and prejudice? Enough! The judge barked, slamming his gavel. Mr. Finch, your client will have his chance to respond. Proceed. Finch glared at Veronica, then turned to Pike, leaning down to whisper. Keep your mouth shut, I'll handle this. But Sheriff Pike was unraveling his ego. Years in the making. Couldn't tolerate being challenged in front of the town he believed he owned. He stood abruptly, ignoring his attorney's frantic tug on his sleeve. You want to know the truth? Pike's voice boomed through the courtroom, silencing the room. Fine, I don't regret a damn thing. Men like him don't get to come here and act like they're better than the rest of us. I don't care how much money he has, or what kind of car he drives. This is my town, my rules. The crowd gasped. Even Finch paled, his face a mask of horror as he hissed, Sit down! Pike wasn't finished. He thinks he can walk in here and call me corrupt. I've spent my life keeping this town safe. People like him don't belong, and I'm not afraid to say it. J.D. rose slowly, his calm, a stark contrast to Pike's rage. All eyes turned to him. He stepped forward, the room holding its breath, as he faced the man across the courtroom. "You just prove my point, Sheriff," J.D. said evenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This isn't about safety, it's about your ego, it's about power. You thought you could intimidate me, humiliate me, because you thought I wouldn't fight back." Pike glared at him, his shoulders heaving with anger. "You're damn right And you failed," J.D. said sharply, cutting him off. "You failed because men like you always fail eventually. You build your power on fear and silence, but when people stand up, when they fight back, your house of cards falls." The courtroom erupted, a mixture of applause, gasps, and shouts of outrage. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order, order in this court!" Pike finally sat, seething, his face red. His attorney buried his head in his hands, knowing the damage was done. J.D. turned to face the judge, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I didn't come here to start a war. I came here because I refuse to let one man's hatred define me. Or this town. The question before us now is simple. Will we let him get away with it?" The room fell silent again, as the judge looked from J.D. to Pike, his expression unreadable. He sighed deeply, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. "We'll take a recess, this court will reconvene shortly." The gavel hit the bench, and the tension in the room hung thick as the judge rose and exited. The crowd burst into motion, reporters scrambling to get their stories, townspeople whispering among themselves. Veronica grabbed J.D.'s arm, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "He just sank himself," she said quietly. "We've got him." But J.D. didn't smile. He looked across the room at Sheriff Pike, who sat slumped, his hands gripping the table. Men like Pike didn't go quietly, and J.D. knew the fight wasn't over yet. Reggie approached, his phone in hand. "You need to see this." He held up the screen, and J.D.'s heart dropped. There, on social media, were rumors swirling, half-truths and lies painting J.D. as a troublemaker, someone stirring up chaos for his own gain. "They're trying to turn this around on you," Reggie said. "Pike's people are doubling down. You might have won in there, but they're not going to let this go." J.D. clenched his jaw. He'd expected as much. Exposing the truth was one thing. Changing the system that protected men like Pike was another. "We'll handle it," Veronica said firmly, but even she looked unsettled. "One step at a time." J.D. nodded, his resolve unshaken. "Let them come, I didn't come this far to back down now." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. Some cheered for J.D., and others shouted angrily, their faces red with frustration. J.D. stepped onto the steps, the cameras turning toward him. "Mr. Walker, do you feel justice has been served?" a reporter called out. J.D. paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "Justice isn't a single moment," he said clearly. "It's a process, and we've just begun." As he stepped back, Veronica leaned in. "You sure you're ready for what comes next?" J.D. turned, his gaze steady. "I've been ready my whole life." The courthouse loomed behind him, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town. Hazelwood's reckoning had begun. But for J.D., it was far from over. The courthouse was buzzing when the recess ended. People spilled back into the courtroom, their faces eager, whispers spreading like wildfire about what had just transpired. Sheriff Pike's outburst had lit a spark that couldn't be extinguished, and J.D. Walker knew that this moment, this fight, had grown into something much larger than himself. J.D. sat calmly, his shoulders square and his face composed, as Veronica leaned close. "Pike knows he slipped up," she whispered. "The judge has to take that into account. He all but admitted to profiling you." J.D. nodded, though he knew better than to celebrate too soon. Men like Pike were like cornered animals. They struck hard when their backs were against the wall. He had seen it in business, in life, and now, right here in this town. Sheriff Pike, red-faced and furious, still sat with his lawyer, who was practically hissing at him to keep his mouth shut. The damage was done, though there was no hiding Pike's words, no covering for the venom he'd spewed. It was on record, and everyone knew it. The judge returned, gavel in hand, calling the courtroom to order. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented and considered both arguments," he began, his tone measured. "The statements made by Sheriff Pike are deeply troubling and have cast a shadow over his conduct and motivations." He paused, the silence heavy with anticipation. It is clear that Mr. Walker's detainment and harassment were not justified and were, in fact, motivated by bias. A murmur ran through the room. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I find cause to move forward with a formal investigation into Sheriff Pike's conduct, as well as the broader practices of the Hazelwood Sheriff's Department." The courtroom erupted, gasps of disbelief from Pike's supporters, cheers from those who had stood by J.D. Sheriff Pike slammed a fist on the table, rising so quickly that his chair toppled over. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his face crimson. "This whole thing is a damn witch hunt." "Sheriff Pike," the judge warned, his voice sharp. "One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt." Pike froze, his chest heaving with rage. His lawyer pulled at his sleeve, whispering urgently, but Pike refused to sit down. Instead, he turned to face J.D., pointing an accusatory finger. "You think you won something here?" he growled, his voice low but venomous. "This is my town. You don't belong here, and you never will." J.D. stood slowly, meeting Pike's glare with a calm, unshakable resolve. "I don't need your permission to exist here," J.D. said, his voice steady and clear. "And this town doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who live in it, all of them." The crowd erupted again, as Pike's lawyer finally pulled him out of the courtroom, reporters scrambling after them, like a pack of wolves. J.D. turned to Veronica, who was already smiling. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but triumphant. "This is just the beginning, but it's a damn good start." Outside, the courthouse steps had become a spectacle. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Sheriff Pike stormed past them, barking at his lawyer to fix this mess, but the damage was done. His authority, once so unshakable, was now crumbling in real time. J.D. stepped out into the sunlight, greeted by applause and cheers from the growing crowd. Reggie was among them, waving him over. "Man, you were incredible in there," Reggie said, clapping J.D. on the back. "You put Pike in his place for the whole town to see." J.D. smiled faintly, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. "It's not over yet," he said. "But we've made a dent." Reggie gestured to the crowd. "Yeah, but look at this, people are finally waking up, J.D. You did that." J.D. turned to take in the scene. The courthouse lawn was filled with locals holding signs, cheering, and chanting for justice. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about change. Real, tangible change. For once, Hazelwood's silence had been broken. Over the following weeks, the investigation into Sheriff Pike's department uncovered a staggering pattern of abuse. Reports of unlawful arrests, racially motivated harassment, and abuse of power began to surface. Deputies who'd once stood in Pike's shadow came forward, sharing stories they'd buried out of fear. The media latched onto the story, turning Hazelwood into a national headline. Sheriff Pike was suspended pending the results of the investigation, and the community began to grapple with the truth of what had been happening in their town for years. J.D., meanwhile, returned to his life in New York, but his days were far from quiet. The incident had sparked a movement. Calls poured in from activists, community leaders, and national organizations eager to hear his story. He became a voice for change, using his platform to speak out against systemic injustice. At the Walker Foundation offices, Reggie burst into J.D.'s office one afternoon, a broad grin on his face. "Check this out," Reggie said, dropping a thick envelope on J.D.'s desk. J.D. picked it up, skimming the first few pages. His brow furrowed, then lifted in surprise. "It's a proposal," Reggie explained. "Some of the local leaders in Hazelwood want to partner with the foundation to fund education, mentorship, and community programs. They're asking for your help, J.D." J.D. leaned back in his chair, a smile pulling at the corner of his lips. The idea of going back to Hazelwood had once seemed impossible. But now, "It's a start," J.D. said quietly. "One step at a time." Reggie grinned. "So, you're in?" J.D. nodded, a deep sense of purpose settling in his chest. "Yeah, I'm in." Months later, JD stood on the steps of Hazelwood's newly renovated community center. The sun was shining, and the air was alive with possibility. Children played on the lawn, volunteers handed out food and supplies, and families gathered to celebrate the opening of the center, a project funded by the Walker Foundation. JD looked out over the crowd, spotting familiar faces. Reggie stood beside him, shaking hands with local leaders. Veronica was there too, her arms crossed as she watched with pride. Even Mitchell, the hesitant deputy who had helped turn the tide, was in attendance, now working for a reformed sheriff's office. JD stepped up to the podium, the crowd falling silent as he spoke. "When I first came to this town," he began, "I wasn't welcomed with open arms, but I didn't come here to fight. I came here to sit at the table, like anyone else. What happened to me was wrong, but it revealed something far more important. Change isn't just possible. It's necessary, and it starts with us." The crowd erupted in applause. JD stepped back, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. He knew the work wasn't finished. There would always be another fight, another injustice to challenge. But for now, this moment was enough. As the celebration continued, Reggie approached, a drink in hand. "You think Pike's watching this on the news?" he asked with a smirk. JD chuckled softly. "If he is, I hope he's taking notes." Reggie grinned, clinking his cup against JD's. "To change, my friend." JD smiled, feeling a rare sense of peace. To change. As the sun set over Hazelwood, the laughter of children echoed through the air. The community center stood as a symbol of hope and possibility. A reminder that, even in the darkest places, light could break through. And JD Walker, the man who once stood alone, now stood surrounded by a community determined to move forward, together. The Hazelwood Community Center buzzed with life as the final rays of sunlight melted into the horizon. Families gathered in clusters, children laughing, and volunteers handing out the last of the food boxes. JD Walker sat quietly on a bench at the edge of the lawn, watching the scene unfold like a vision of the future he had once doubted was possible. This wasn't the town he had first encountered, a place defined by silence and lingering tension. It wasn't perfect, nowhere ever was, but it was different. The community had taken its first steps toward healing, toward seeing one another as more than stereotypes and assumptions. For JD, this moment felt like a turning point, not just for Hazelwood, but for himself. Over the months since his confrontation with Sheriff Pike, the ripples had spread further than he could have imagined. The investigation had been swift and decisive. Uncovering years of abuse hidden under the thin veneer of authority, Sheriff Pike had been removed from office, facing charges that would hold him accountable for his actions. For some, it was the justice they'd been waiting for. For others, it was just the beginning of a long road toward rebuilding trust. JD hadn't stayed for Pike's downfall. That had never been the point. His fight had always been about something larger than one man. It had been about shifting an entire system, about forcing the people of Hazelwood to see what they'd ignored for far too long. And they had seen. Veronica had been instrumental in steering the town's conversations forward, becoming a leading voice for accountability and change. She had helped local leaders form a civilian oversight committee, ensuring no one else would suffer under unchecked authority again. People like Mitchell, who had once hesitated to take a stand, now found their voices too, determined to protect their community rather than simply maintaining the status quo. JD had watched it all unfold from afar, supporting the work while refocusing on the Walker Foundation. But Hazelwood stayed with him. A town that had once rejected him was now a reminder of what change looked like when enough people believed it could happen. Sitting on that bench, JD reflected on the man he had been before stepping foot in Hazelwood. He'd always believed in hard work, in progress, in fighting for what was right. But something about this experience had deepened that resolve. He had been reminded that no matter how much success a person achieves, some battles still feel inescapable. Prejudice, injustice, and bias had followed him even into rooms he was told he'd earned the right to enter. It would have been easy to walk away, to let the anger and frustration take root. But instead, he had chosen to fight. Not with fists or rage, but with resilience, grace, and an unshakable belief in his own worth. He had learned long ago that dignity was something no one could take from you unless you let them. The events in Hazelwood had been a test of that belief, a test he had passed, not for himself, but for the people who'd watched. for the kids in the community who now had a center to learn and grow, and for the future leaders who would remember that change was possible. He'd also come to understand that change wasn't always about grand gestures or dramatic victories. Sometimes it was about the small moments, a quiet conversation that shifted someone's perspective, a decision to challenge what had always been accepted, or a single person refusing to back down in the face of injustice. Those were the moments that mattered. Reggie joined JD on the bench, handing him a bottle of water. "You good?" JD nodded, taking the bottle and twisting the cap open. "Yeah, just taking it all in." Reggie followed JD's gaze across the lawn, where children played tag under the watchful eyes of their parents. "Not bad for a town that once told you to leave, huh?" JD chuckled softly. "Not bad at all." Reggie turned to him, his tone growing serious. "You know, you changed a lot of lives here, JD, mine included." JD looked over, his brow raised. "I used to think this kind of thing was impossible," Reggie continued, "that people like Pike would always win, and people like us just had to keep our heads down. But watching you stand up to him, it made me realize we don't have to live like that. We don't have to accept things the way they are." JD smiled, a mix of pride and humility in his expression. "It's not about one person, Reggie. I didn't do this alone. People like Veronica, Mitchell, and everyone out here today, they stepped up too." "Maybe," Reggie agreed, "but someone had to light the fire." JD didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on the families gathered at the community center. He had lit the fire, but they had carried it forward. That's what real change looked like. It belonged to everyone. Later that evening, JD stood at the podium inside the center's main hall. The crowd had gathered for the closing ceremony, their faces eager and hopeful. He scanned the room, his heart full. "I came to Hazelwood expecting nothing more than a quiet visit," he began, his voice steady. "Instead, I found myself in the middle of a fight I hadn't planned for. But sometimes life does that. It puts you exactly where you need to be, whether you're ready for it or not." The crowd was silent, hanging on to his words. "What happened here wasn't about me," JD continued. "It was about all of us. It was about asking ourselves hard questions. Who are we? What do we value? And what are we willing to do to build a community where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued? Those questions don't have easy answers, but this," he gestured to the center around them, "this is a start." Applause erupted, filling the room. JD stepped back from the podium, his heart full. As he watched the crowd, he saw something different in their eyes: hope, determination, and the understanding that change didn't stop here. Outside, as the night deepened and families began to leave, JD lingered by the entrance. Veronica approached him, her arms crossed and a small smile on her face. "You're not leaving without saying goodbye, are you?" she teased. "Wouldn't dream of it," JD replied. She nodded, her smile fading into something softer. "You know, this town owes you more than they'll ever admit." JD shook his head. "They don't owe me anything. This isn't about me, it never was." Veronica studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Safe travels, JD, and thank you." As JD drove out of Hazelwood that night, he looked in the rearview mirror at the town that had tested him, frustrated him, and ultimately changed him. He didn't know if Hazelwood would ever fully become the place it could be. But he knew this: progress had been made, and progress would continue. The road ahead stretched long and dark, but JD didn't mind. There were more battles to fight, more communities to help, and more fires to light. But for now, he drove with a sense of peace, carrying with him the lessons of Hazelwood, that even in the face of prejudice and hate, resilience could carve out space for hope. And sometimes, that hope was enough to start something extraordinary. As the lights of Hazelwood disappeared behind him, JD Walker knew he would always carry this place with him, a town that had shown him the power of standing up, speaking out, and refusing to back down. The Nda